Well, hello everyone. Phil here from the Blue Envelope channel. Well, it was in January 2023 that JW Broadcasting announced that the hour requirement for regular pioneers would be reduced.
For regular pioneers, the requirement will now be 600 hours per year. That is an average of 50 hours per month.
Now, for viewers who may not be Jehovah's Witnesses or don't know what a pioneer is or why they're called that, you can check out my other video, Why Are Jehovah's Witness Members Called Pioneers? The cliff notes are that to be in good standing, all witnesses are required to spend time each month proselytizing or trying to convert people into the group. Now, the organization no longer releases as much data as it once did, so we don't know exactly how many hours the average witness is doing these days. Historically, the average witness did about 10 to 15 hours per month of this unpaid cold calling, essentially. Now, for those truly dedicated to the cause, or on the other hand, maybe desiring more status in the group, they can sign up to be a regular pioneer. They agree, normally for a minimum of at least a year, to volunteer a higher amount of time each month to that proselytizing work. And it's this hour figure that has just been reduced from 70 down to 50. Now, a reduction in the number of hours that a regular pioneer is required to put in has happened several times over the history of the Jehovah's Witness religion. So who decides what hours are required? Well, God does, now that you ask about it. How do we know that God wants to change the pioneer hour requirement this year? Well, the Watchtower magazine has explained that it's Jehovah that issues the hour requirements. It was discussed as early as the July 1st, 1943 Watchtower in the article Righteous Requirements. On page 204, it points out that Jehovah issued requirements to Jesus when they created humans. In Genesis 1:26, Jehovah issued a call to action to his son, the Logos, and such other agencies as were required for the creation of man in these words, "And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." This is all there was to it. Jehovah expressed his will. That expressed will became organization instructions to the Logos. And obviously we know that Jesus followed those instructions to a T, since here we are as humans. The article goes on to explain that in our day, Jehovah is still issuing requirements to his servants by means this time of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania Incorporated. The Lord breaks down our organization instructions further and makes them more practicable by further instructing us through his faithful and wise servant. He says, "Let us assign the field, the world, to special pioneers, regular pioneers, and companies of Jehovah's Witnesses in an orderly way, sufficient for everyone to thoroughly witness therein, and let us place upon each one the responsibility of caring for the New World interests in these respective assignments." He says the requirements for special pioneers shall be 175 hours and 50 back calls per month, which should develop into a reasonable number of studies. And for regular pioneers, 150 hours and as many back calls and studies as can be properly developed during that time. And for company publishers, he says, let us make a quota of 60 hours and 12 back calls and at least one study a week for each publisher. These directions come to us from the Lord through his established agency directing what is required of us. And for those who really love the Lord and are guided by his counsel, that is a reasonable service requirement. This expression of the Lord's will should be the end of all controversy. It is for your good that these requirements are made, for thereby you are enabled to prove your integrity and magnify the Lord's name. Now the article goes on to explain that God has also issued other instructions for us. The Lord, through his faithful and wise servant, now states to us, "Let us cover our territory 4 times in 6 months." That becomes our organization instructions and has the same binding force on us that his statement to the Logos had when he said, "Let us make man in our image." It is our duty to accept this additional instruction and obey it. So, if God issued the requirement for regular pioneers to put in 150 hours per month, why is his organization saying they'll now only be required to put in 50 hours per month? Did Jehovah change his mind? Well, on the one hand, Malachi 3:6 says, "For I am Jehovah, I do not change." On the other hand, it's also true that he sometimes changes his mind about things. For example, I was going to get a ham sub for lunch today, but when I learned they were out of ham, I changed my mind and got a turkey sub instead. Well, God works in the same way. Here, the Watchtower of June 15th, 2013 explains it well on page 27. The way that God is willing to mold us shows that he is reasonable and adaptable. That is evident in situations where Jehovah determines to take action based on his just judgment of people, but then changes his mind because of their response. The scriptures state concerning the first king of Israel that Jehovah regretted that he had caused Saul to reign as king. When the people of Nineveh repented and turned around from their bad way, the Bible says, the true God felt regret over the calamity that he had spoken of causing to them, and he did not cause it. Now, just to be clear, God regretting a course of action doesn't mean he made a mistake. As the Watchtower of January 15th, 2013 explains on page 25, the Bible does not mean that Jehovah made mistakes. Everything he does is perfect. Instead, it means that Jehovah sometimes changes his mind because of a change in circumstances. Now, just to be clear, when it says Jehovah sometimes changes his mind about something, that doesn't mean he sometimes changes his mind about something. Here, notice what the Watchtower of June 1st, 2009 explains on page 23. The biblical examples considered above show that Jehovah God did give different directions and instructions at different times. But that does not mean that he changed his mind. Rather, he responded to the needs of his people under varying circumstances, and he did so for their benefit. The same is true today. So, the decreasing hour requirement for pioneers in no way means Jehovah has changed his mind about what being a pioneer means. It's simply that pioneers in 1943 had certain circumstances, and pioneers in 2023 have other circumstances. After all, we're now 80 years deeper into the time of the end. It makes sense that since we're now in, how did they put it?
In the final part of the last days, undoubtedly, the final part of the final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days.
Yeah, it makes sense that since we're at this point in history, that God's organization would, take the foot off the gas, ease up in how much proselytizing pioneers are doing, and not warn as many people anymore as they used to. Here, notice how the 1942 yearbook explains it on page 42. Under the subheading Hours, it says, the one thing that a publisher has and can devote to the Lord is time. While the aggregate of 14,533,140 hours is a tremendous amount of time, there is room for great improvement on the part of all the publishers, both company and pioneer. Brother Rutherford has brought this to the attention of the brethren time and again through special letters. The Watchtower has pointed out the need of more time, and as the days become more perilous and the time shorter, every one of the servants of the theocracy should endeavor to do more in the strange work that the Lord has committed into our hands. Yes, the organization points out that the shorter the time left, the more and more time should be devoted to trying to convert people into Jehovah's Witnesses so they can survive Armageddon. It's a matter of life and death. Now, admittedly, reducing the pioneer hour requirement seems to be the exact opposite of that, but that's probably just why I'm not on the governing body.
Oh, that doesn't make sense to me. But then, you are very small.
Now, all that aside, it's pretty interesting to analyze the numbers of pioneers over the years against the drops in hour requirements over the years. So I wanted in this video to kind of dive into the statistics a little bit here. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a graph of the number of pioneers from the period 1922 until 1948. I went till 1948 on this graph since before 1949, the yearbooks mainly printed the pioneer figures only by country and not worldwide figures. But we can kind of use these U.S. figures as a proxy since at that point, that's where the vast majority of pioneers were located anyhow. So what we see is it starts out kind of level, and then we see pretty good growth in the pioneer numbers in the late 1920s as the society began to emphasize that more for Bible students. However, as we know, in 1929, the U.S. entered the Great Depression, which made it really difficult economically for a lot of people. And so we see the pioneer numbers kind of level out there in the 1930s, if not decrease a little bit. The first yearbook I found that mentions an official hour requirement for pioneers is the 1935 yearbook. To be a pioneer, one is required to devote a minimum of 110 hours per month to the actual work of bearing testimony to the people. Now, that was the ground floor for putting hours in, was 110 hours per month. For example, the informant, the pre-runner to the Kingdom Ministry, in August 1936 says, the very minimum number of hours for pioneers is 110 each month, and this is to be exceeded in order that an effective witness may be given and the pioneer get on well. Now, when they say it should be exceeded, what did they have in mind? Well, notice the November 1940 informant. Every person interested in the theocracy should strive diligently to be a publisher and then do all within his power to put in as many hours in the field as possible and strive toward that quota of 60 hours per company publisher or of 150 hours per month for pioneers, having in mind, too, the 12 back calls per month per publisher. Publishers, hours, and back calls should be kept prominently before the minds of the brethren throughout the year. Now, Christians in general may not have realized that to truly be a follower of the teachings of Christ Jesus, you need to be meeting your monthly quotas. I know Jesus doesn't discuss quotas a ton in the Gospels, but it's there if you read between the lines. Now, in the late 1930s, we see a pretty big jump up in pioneers, although I will say it's a bit misleading since at this point in time, the yearbook pretty much began publishing peak pioneer numbers during global preaching campaigns and not the average pioneer numbers as they had been before. So there probably was an increase, but not as much as it looks like. In this time period, the 1942 yearbook that we read earlier, talking about the importance of time spent in the ministry, also kind of chastised witnesses for missing their monthly quotas. The company publishers, of which there was an average of 52,696 each month, devoted 14.7 hours per publisher. This is far from the 60-hour quota, toward which all company publishers should strive. Pioneers devoted, on the average, 106.9 hours for each of the 4,049 reporting monthly throughout the year. This can be greatly improved by striving toward that 150-hour requirement. Around this time, under the direction of the new Watchtower Society president, Nathan Knorr, 1942 saw a resurrection of the Special Pioneer program. Special pioneers were required to put in 175 hours per month, as opposed to the quota of 150 for regular pioneers. In exchange, they were paid by the society, essentially as independent contractors. For example, the 1946 yearbook reported that the society paid them $190 per year plus store credit for literature. In today's dollars, that would be roughly a couple $100 per month. Not a whole lot, but really not a bad deal for only 25 hours more a month than regular pioneers who were unpaid. Now, although we see high peaks in pioneer numbers in 1941 and 1943, the 1944 yearbook calls out that although the quota was 150 hours, pioneers are only putting in an average of 111.8 hours per month. And so that year, the society decided to bite the bullet and cull from the rolls all pioneers who weren't making their time, other than elderly pioneers who had been in the work for decades. And so they deleted 20% of the pioneers at that point, almost 1,000, as we see dropping from 1943 to 1944. The 1945 yearbook discussed this decision on pages 60 and 61. It will be noted that in comparing the average hours of the general pioneer of last year with the pioneer of this year, there has been a great improvement. During the service year of 1943, the records show that there was an average of 4,788 general pioneers on the list, averaging 111.8 hours per month. Whereas now there are only 3,834 on the list, but they average 130.2 hours. Speaking of 1943, it says, during the year, the pioneer list reached a total enrolled of over 5,700. But hundreds of those brethren were putting in only 40, 50, and 60 hours a month of field service and were not living up to their agreement with the society to put in 150 hours or thereabouts. Now, I think this is kind of a key passage in understanding when and why the society has dropped the pioneer hour requirement over the years. We see here that they made the correlation between the number of pioneers and the hours put in by those pioneers. So in this case, they could go from a large number of lower hour pioneers to a small group of higher hour pioneers, and in the end, still essentially maintain the same total hours being turned in. Now, on the other hand, we'll see in the future that they could also flip that the other way. They could drop the required hours and still have the same total hours of preaching done if the number of pioneers goes up in response. Incidentally, it's in this 1945 yearbook where the question is discussed, what is the greatest privilege a Christian can have? Take a second and think about that. What is the greatest privilege a Christian can have? Is it perhaps getting baptized, dedicating your entire life to God? Is it maybe having a really good conversation with someone about the Bible? Maybe even starting a Bible study with them and eventually seeing them dedicate their life to God? Is it perhaps a parent raising their child to be a good person and a faithful servant of the Creator? Well, note the organization's answer on page 62. The grandest of all privileges anyone can enjoy is to be in the full-time service of the Lord, either in one of the Society's institutions or as a pioneer publisher. I suppose you might be surprised to learn that the grandest privilege has to do with meeting monthly quotas. Man, when you meet that monthly quota of 150 hours, there's nothing better.
And oh, how sweet.
Yes, being able to write 150 on your time slip is the true essence of being a follower of Christ. I'm glad they cleared that up for us. And so, as you might imagine, after the stricter standards for pioneers were introduced, we see a steady decline in the pioneer ranks the next few years. The 1948 yearbook sounds a bit puzzled about it on page 49. For some reason or other, the average number of pioneers in the field monthly decreased. And so this decrease leads to the first ever reduction in the pioneer hour requirement. The 1949 yearbook on page 53 says, "It was announced that beginning January 1st, 1948, the Society would reduce the pioneer requirements for regular pioneers from 150 hours to 120 hours per month, or 1,400 hours per year. It was the belief of the President that after the brethren had thought this matter over carefully, there would be a good increase in the number of pioneers for 1948. And so, did it? It says this proved to be true. During the year, a total of 2,147 new general pioneers were enrolled. Throughout the year, an average of 4,143 pioneers were on the list, or 5.7% of all the publishers. While this is a good increase over last year's average of 3,513 pioneers, we here in the United States are still striving for that desired goal of 10% of all publishers in the pioneer service. The yearbook also kind of calls out the reasons that it perceives for the drop in the pioneer ranks in the previous years. Higher living costs and fewer placements of literature, and the desire to increase backcall activity made it difficult for pioneers to continue without outside assistance. So it mentions higher living costs here as World War II ended. Also that pioneers were having fewer placements of literature. Recall that before 1990, pioneers could buy the literature at cost and then sell it door to door at full retail price, keeping the profits as income. And so fewer literature sales meant less money coming in for pioneers. A related issue was the Society's desire under Nathan Knorr to shift solely from a focus on literature sales to improving the teaching skills and activities of Jehovah's Witnesses. While admirable, this desire to increase the backcall or return visit activity meant less money coming in for pioneers. You didn't earn any money conducting a Bible study, just from selling or placing books in literature. Now, on the surface, having each pioneer turn in 360 less hours each year would seem to result in a massive overall drop in hours. But as we know, the society had learned the interplay between the number of pioneers and the hours completed. The drop in required hours from a total of 3,513 pioneers would be about 1.3 million hours lost. In essence, they would need 1,054 new pioneers to make that up, or a total of 4,567. And in fact, they hit that just 1 year later in 1949 when there were 4,637 pioneers in the U.S. After that point, when they had recouped the losses, any new pioneers would be pure profit, as it were. And the yearbook mentions that they were at 5.7% of publishers being pioneers, whereas the goal was that 10% of all publishers were pioneering, which again would almost double the hours that pioneers were turning in. Well, the net result of that 1948 reduction in the pioneer hour requirement was so successful, the society decided to do it again. In March 1949, the Society released a new handbook for organizational procedures, a 64-page booklet called Council on Theocratic Organization for Jehovah's Witnesses. The informant of March 1949 states, as stated in Council on Theocratic Organization for Jehovah's Witnesses, the requirement for general pioneers is now 100 hours per month. So the hour requirement dropped another 20 hours per month to 1,200 per year. The informant also mentions the goal of how many publishers they want to see pioneering. During the service year of 1949, our goal for pioneers continues to be 10% of the average number of publishers. Okay, so now let's shift to the next graph here. So this will be from 1949 up to 1980. And again, we can think about what is the calculus for pioneers versus hours. Well, there were 8,994 pioneers worldwide in 1948. And so to make up the hours lost from the decreased hour requirement, they would need to add 1,799 new pioneers to the ranks, or a new total of 10,793. And in fact, they reached that total later that year in 1949 with a total of 10,973 pioneers. And again, after that number was reached, everything above that would be profit, would be gravy for the next 27 years, in fact. It's actually kind of surprising, seeing that it worked so well, that they waited so long to adjust again from a smaller number of high-hour pioneers to a larger number of lower-hour pioneers. And just to mention, in 1950, the percentage of publishers that were pioneers was 3.9%. Now, after that second drop in the hour requirement, we again see an increase for several years. It was during this time that the Gilead School had been established for missionaries, and the society was seeing huge increases in the number of lands as those missionaries spread around the world. And in fact, the society wondered why every country couldn't grow at that same rate. For example, in the 1951 yearbook on page 28, it says, every company will continue to strive for the quota of a 10% increase as it has in previous years, but it should not stop at that. Why not, in addition, have every company, by the Lord's grace, strive for at least a 34% increase on its peak number of publishers? So we have kind of the main corporate goal of 10% growth per year, and then we have the stretch goal of 34% growth for each franchise location. Congregation. But what we see is that in those post-war years of the early 1950s, that the pioneer numbers actually start to flatten out and even start decreasing. The 1956 yearbook commented on that on page 38. Today there are 17,011 full-time ordained ministers working throughout the world. To these ranks there could be added many more, and the Society confidently hopes that those who can arrange their affairs to get into the full-time ministerial activity will do so, for in this field there is an abundant blessing. A slight decrease in the number of pioneers has appeared during 1955 service year, there being 254 fewer full-time ministers than in 1954. We sincerely hope that this becomes reversed during the 1956 service year, and that many more will feel confident that Jehovah will open up the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing greater than the pioneers can contain, even as he is doing for all of his servants in overflowing measure. Well, this encouragement evidently worked, and we see the numbers start to pick up again. Entering the 1960s, we see steady growth in the pioneer ranks. Now, one side point to make is that the number of pioneers reported in the annual report is not just regular pioneers. For example, the 1958 yearbook reports the number of pioneers that year as 20,912. However, the text on page 40 notes that there are actually several groups encompassed in that number. And backing them up in full-time service are 20,912 pioneers, special pioneers, missionaries, and circuit and district servants scattered all over the world. Now, I'm guessing that's still the case, that all those people are included in the pioneer number. I guess I don't know for sure, though. In the late 60s, the new doctrine was introduced that 6,000 years of human existence would end in 1975, and that it would be very fitting if Armageddon and Christ's millennial reign would happen that year. Well, this doctrine kicked off an amazing period of growth in the organization. In 1966, when the book Life Everlasting and Freedom of the Sons of God was released, which explained this new teaching, there were 47,092 pioneers. A decade later, in 1975, there were 130,225 pioneers, with especially notable new peaks in 1974 and 1975. Unfortunately, after the pioneers' sprint to the finish line of 74 and 75 happened, but the finish line of the new system didn't appear, a lot of folks came off the pioneer list. And we see that 13% of pioneers, or 16,299, quit from 1975 to 1976. Well, as the bad news of this drop started rolling in month by month from the service reports into Watchtower headquarters in 1976, they eventually acted to try and stop this steady exodus of pioneers, and they issued the news in October 1976 that the pioneer hour requirement would be dropped from 1,200 to 1,000 hours per year, or in other words, from 100 hours a month to 90 hours per month. So you can see, we know there was actually a little wiggle room built in, because technically you only needed 83.3 hours per month to make your 1,000 hours for the year. So it's a little hard to tell how much the drop in required hours helped salvage the pioneer numbers in this post-1975 period versus just everyone's disappointment wearing off eventually. But at any rate, by 1979, we see pioneer numbers start to increase again. And so again, we can do the calculus of how many new pioneers would be needed to make up for this drop in hours that each pioneer would be turning in. We can be sure the society did the exact same calculus in 1976 before they announced the hour drop. So there were 113,926 pioneers in 1976, and the hour drop would mean a loss of almost 23 million hours being turned in. In effect, they would need to add 22,785 new pioneers to make up for that, or a new total pioneer number of 136,711. Now, unlike the last 2-hour reductions, when the total hours being turned in only took about a year to recover, this time it took a little longer, about 4 years. We see that it was in 1980 that they had a total of 137,861 pioneers. And again, after they reached that point, everything was pure profit for the next 19 years. And it's worth mentioning that in 1980, the percent of publishers that were pioneering was up to 6.3%. Okay, let's move on to the next graph. I overlapped this one a little bit with the previous graph. This one starts in 1976, so we can start from that hour reduction and move forward until the present day. And what we see is that the 80s and 90s were another period of strong, steady growth for Jehovah's Witness pioneers. It was in 1985 that the organization finally crossed that holy grail of having 10% of all publishers pioneering, with 11.3% being pioneers that year. In the early 90s, the Iron Curtain fell, and that resulted in another big influx of witnesses and pioneers in Eastern Europe. And then what we see is that in the late 90s, the pioneer numbers start to get relatively flat again. Keep in mind, it had been about 20 years since the last hour reduction. And so in January 1999, it was announced that the hour requirement would be reduced from 90 hours a month down to 70 hours a month, or 840 hours per year. I remember I was pioneering in that year, and it was a huge relief to hear that announcement. I was always on the edge of calculating how I could get just 83.3 hours per month and still make my time for the year. Although I have to admit that somehow soon I found it just as hard to get 70 hours per month in as it had been to get 83. So what was the calculus this time? Well, there were 698,781 pioneers in 1998, and that drop in required hours would mean a loss of about 112 million hours. In effect, they would need to add 133,101 new pioneers to make it up, or a new total of 831,882. And that took about 5 years to get to that point. In 2004, they had 858,461. And again, since then, it's been all gravy for the next 19 years. Probably the most notable thing on this graph is that in 2005, there was a huge drop in pioneers, 27%. And to be totally honest, I'm not sure the reason for this. I don't remember any major doctrinal changes in the organization at that point. I didn't really see any articles chastising witnesses for stopping pioneering as we saw in earlier decades. So it's hard to say what was behind this drop-off. I'd be curious to hear comments from viewers if you have any insight on that. I will say 2005 was a brutal year for natural disasters, which maybe had something to do with it. In December 2004, there was a giant tsunami in Indonesia. 2005 had an earthquake in Sumatra. There was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. There were multiple hurricanes in Florida and multiple typhoons in Japan. So at any rate, it took about 6 years to bounce back to where the numbers had been in 2004. It's interesting to kind of think about the big picture that if we exclude that big drop that happened in 2005 for whatever reason, we can see that there tends to be about 15, 20-year cycles in the pioneer numbers. So there's a drop in the hour requirement issued, and then there's strong, steady growth in the pioneer numbers for about 10 to 15 years, and then it levels off for a few years. It gets pretty flat, and then a new hour reduction is announced to start that cycle all over again. So with that idea in mind, we can see that from about 2017 until now, the pioneer numbers started to level out and get kind of flat again. Now, as a side note, the publisher numbers in this period also flattened out, and the net effect is that the percentage of publishers that are pioneering has actually continued to increase over the years. In 2021, it was up to 15.9% of all publishers were pioneering. So it's been now 24 years since the last hour reduction for pioneers in 1999, and it probably then comes as not a big surprise that the organization is announcing a new hour reduction. So as we know, the hours are being dropped from 70 down to 50 hours per month. And so again, we can do the calculus for this reduction. There were 1,350,138 pioneers in 2021. Now, keep in mind the 76 reduction was 17 hours a month. The 99 reduction was actually only 13 hours per month. But this 2023 reduction is back to the full 20 hours a month less as it was back in 1949. So that's a big loss of hours, more than 324 million hours per year. In effect, the society will need to add 540,000 new pioneers to make up for that loss of hours. So on the one hand, that sounds like a lot of pioneers. On the other hand, that's about between 4 and 5 new pioneers per congregation, which doesn't sound so bad. Essentially, any regular auxiliary pioneers right now can just convert into regular pioneers. So that's probably a couple in each congregation. If the previous pattern holds, it should take about 5 years or so to recoup the loss of hours by the growth in pioneer numbers. And we should then expect about 10 years of steady growth in pioneer numbers, followed then by a few years of little to no growth. And by then, it should be about time for a new hour reduction, probably around the year 2040. I don't know, what are we thinking? 40 hours in 2040? Kind of has a nice ring to it. Now, obviously, the hours being reported no longer have much, if any, connection to the numerical growth in the organization. Many of the hours are duplicates, as multiple witnesses stand by a single literature kiosk, all of them often interacting with nobody in the community. And many more of the hours are not preaching at all. They're hours spent volunteering on organization projects, construction, or other work for the various branch offices. I guess there is one thing we can be sure of, and that is that unfortunately, not a single one of those hours will be spent on humanitarian projects, helping homeless people, running a soup kitchen, or even things for folks in the congregation, helping elderly or needy members to get to doctor's appointments or mowing their lawn. At this point, renting a couple of billboards in the community and calling it a day would probably be just as effective in the conversion rates as all the hours a congregation spends in the ministry. But instead, history shows that the new reduction in the hour requirement will mean that more and more witnesses will start pioneering. And every witness the organization can persuade to become a pioneer means another 50 less hours that the congregation as a whole will spend helping out in their community, 50 less hours they'll spend with their family members, and for that matter, another 50 less hours that members can spend on practices to protect and improve their mental health. And that, I guess, to me is maybe the saddest thing about the whole pioneer arrangement. Well, this is getting to be a bit of a downer. Okay, to pick it up, we need to end with that classic song about something a lot of new pioneers will no doubt be using for a lot of those 50 hours every month. Hey, thanks for watching. Subscribe if you like, and we'll catch you in the next video.
What a feeling to go wheeling. I'm so glad to be a public witness. Come.